In a world where power and money often decide respect, one moment at a luxury hotel changes everything. A powerful billionaire thinks no one understands his words, but the waitress he mocks carries a secret that will leave the entire room stunned. The Chu's restaurant glowed with golden light, every chandelier catching the shimmer of crystal glasses and polished silverware. It was the kind of evening where luxury hung in the air like perfume, where whispers of deals and fortunes moved quietly between tables. Waiters in black uniforms glided gracefully across the room, balancing trays of delicately plated dishes, while a pianist in the corner played a soft, steady melody. At the center of this refined setting stood a young black waitress, carrying herself with a quiet poise. She had the posture of someone trained to fade into the background, yet there was something in her steady walk, her calm face, and her careful attention to detail that set her apart. Her eyes missed nothing, even though she never lingered too long on a single face. Tonight was a particularly heavy night for her and the staff. A private dinner had been arranged for a circle of powerful business executives, men who controlled empires with a single word. They had demanded perfection, and the hotel management had delivered it. Every tablecloth had been pressed without a crease, every glass polished until it gleamed like ice. The executives began filing in, their voices filling the space with authority. They were dressed in suits worth more than most people's yearly wages, each of them wearing the same mask of practiced confidence. The waitstaff moved quickly to meet their demands, but in this world, servers were invisible, merely instruments, in the symphony of wealth. Then came the entrance that shifted the energy of the entire room. The billionaire himself walked in, surrounded by an entourage that seemed to orbit him like planets around the sun. His presence was magnetic, though not in a comforting way. He radiated command, and his arrogance preceded him as if it had arrived 5 minutes earlier. Conversation softened as he crossed the floor, heads turned, and even the executives already seated straightened their postures in a silent acknowledgement of his dominance. He thrived on this reaction. It was the fuel that kept his ego burning. He didn't glance at the staff as he passed them. They were no more significant to him than the chairs pulled out for his comfort. The waitress, standing at the ready with her notepad tucked neatly in her apron, saw the flicker of dismissal in his eyes before he even sat down. When his assistants leaned in to brief him on the evening's agenda, he waved them off with a bored hand, already surveying the room as though he owned not just the hotel but the very air within it. When it was her turn to approach his table, she stepped forward smoothly, every movement measured and practiced. She asked in a polite and steady tone if he would like to hear the chef's specials. He glanced at her for only a second, as if annoyed that she dared interrupt the current of his evening. His eyes, sharp and calculating, lingered on her just long enough to make it clear she was beneath his interest. He didn't answer right away, instead turning his head slightly toward his associates, his lips curving into a smirk. In fluent Arabic, he let out a remark that dripped with cruelty. His words painted her as someone unworthy of serving such a prestigious table, mocking not only her appearance but also presuming her lack of education. The comment wasn't loud enough for the whole room to hear, but it was deliberate, just, sharp enough for those nearest him to catch. His associates chuckled nervously, forced to share in his joke, though discomfort flickered across their expressions. They laughed because power demanded it, not because humor was found in the insult. The waitress stood silently, pen poised above her notepad as if nothing had been said. Her face didn't change, her posture remained steady, and not a flicker of reaction betrayed her. Yet behind her calm eyes, every syllable of Arabic had landed clearly. She understood him. She understood the laughter, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. In that moment, her silence was both shield and sword. The billionaire took her composure as ignorance. He leaned back in his chair, chuckling to himself, convinced that his insult had passed over her head. He mistook her stillness for naivety, her politeness for stupidity. And so, with each breath, his arrogance swelled, filling the space between them like smoke. The air grew tense. The executives shifted uncomfortably, sensing an undercurrent they couldn't name. The pianist's notes seemed sharper, the chandeliers brighter, as though the room itself recognized the imbalance. The audience, watching this unfold, if there had been one, would know the truth the man did not. She had understood every word. She carried the weight of his insult not with visible hurt, but with a quiet strength that refused to bend. She knew more than he could ever imagine, and the silence she maintained was not submission, but patience. The kind of patience that waits for the right moment when a single word can change everything. And as she turned to leave the table, the tension followed her like a shadow. The audience was left with the unshakable sense that his arrogance had lit a fuse he didn't know existed, a fuse waiting for the right spark. The evening carried on with the kind of grandeur only money could buy. The long table gleamed under. The chandeliers, filled with crystal glasses, plates of delicately arranged appetizers, and conversations heavy with deals and power. Laughter rose here and there, the kind of laughter meant more to impress than to express joy. The billionaire sat at the head, his presence anchoring the room. Every gesture, every word he spoke was met with attention. He was used to commanding the atmosphere, and tonight was no different, at least in his mind. The waitress moved quietly through the space, attending to each detail with flawless precision. She placed plates, refilled glasses, and responded to subtle gestures with practiced grace. Yet with every approach she made toward the billionaire's side of the table, his eyes followed her not with appreciation for her professionalism, but with thinly veiled disdain. He spoke less to her and more about her, leaning again toward his associates. His voice dropped into that same smooth Arabic, but this time he didn't bother to keep it subtle. He mocked her accent before she could even speak, joked about her background, and belittled the idea that someone like her could ever belong in a space as refined as this. He spoke as if she were furniture, something without ears or dignity, a target too low to ever challenge him. This time his words were louder, sharp enough that the chuckles of his companions drew attention from other guests seated nearby. A few turned their heads, confused at first, then uneasy as the meaning settled in. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unwilling to be drawn into his cruelty but equally unwilling to confront it. A nervous tension fluttered across the room like the draft of a sudden breeze, invisible but undeniable. Yet still no one spoke. Power kept their voices silent. The waitress approached again, balancing a tray with practiced care. On it, a bottle of wine chosen specially for the table, its glass neck catching the light. She placed it before him with steady hands, uncorking it with the kind of skill that came from years of discipline. Not a drop spilled, not a sound broke the refinement of the moment. She poured, filling his glass, her eyes never straying from her task. And then, as she set the bottle gently back onto the table, she spoke. Not in English, not in the language he expected, but in Arabic. The sound of it sliced through the air like a sudden crack of thunder. Every fork stilled, every hand froze halfway to its plate. The pianist in the corner continued to play, but his melody seemed distant now, muffled against the silence that swallowed the room. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and sharp in its precision. She repeated the insult he had cast at her, but not with bitterness, with perfect diction, with a fluency so natural that it disarmed the table. Then she corrected him, her words gliding effortlessly, turning his cruelty into his own undoing. Her tone wasn't raised, her posture didn't shift. She spoke as though delivering a fact, a truth that needed no drama to give it weight. Gasps rippled down the table. Guests leaned back in their chairs, eyes wide, mouths slightly parted. The billionaire's smirk fell from his face, the arrogance, draining as quickly as it had bloomed. His jaw tightened, his eyes widened in disbelief. He was a man unaccustomed to being challenged, especially not here, not like this, and certainly not in his own language. For the first time in years, words failed him. His associates exchanged uneasy glances, their forced chuckles long gone. Their eyes darted between him and the waitress, trying to gauge how to react, but none dared to move. They hadn't expected this. No one had. The room that once seemed to orbit him now revolved around her single moment of defiance. A defiance, made stronger by its calmness. The waitress, however, did not linger. She did not gloat, did not pause to watch the shock settle into his features. She simply adjusted the bottle on the table, smoothed the cloth beside his plate, and turned to continue with her duties as though nothing had been said at all. Her composure remained intact, her professionalism unshaken, but the air around her carried a different weight now. She had revealed a part of herself he could never have predicted, and she had done it without breaking a single rule of etiquette. The billionaire sat in silence, his hand hovering over his glass but not lifting it. The wine, once a symbol of his wealth, now trembled slightly in its stem as if reflecting the shift inside him. The room, once his kingdom, no longer felt under his control. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't anger, though that would come later. It wasn't humiliation, though that lingered in the stares of his companions. It was smallness, the sensation of being stripped of dominance, left exposed before the very people he had hoped to impress. The pianist's notes filled the void, steady and unbroken, while the waitress walked away, her head high, her pace measured. She left him with no chance to recover, no words to reclaim. And as the guests whispered quietly among themselves, their gazes shifting from her to him, it was clear that the balance of the evening had changed forever. He had entered the room as the untouchable center of attention, but in that moment it was she who carried the power, and it was he who sat trembling in its shadow. The room was no longer the same. What had begun as an evening meant to showcase. Wealth, charm, and influence had shifted into something else entirely. The air was heavy with murmurs, the kind of quiet conversations people think go unnoticed but never truly do. Guests leaned closer to one another, their voices lowered, their eyes darting toward the head of the table. The admiration that once clung to the billionaire like a second skin had thinned into doubt, and the whispers carried a different tone now. Curiosity, disapproval, even pity. His arrogance, once seen as confidence, had been unmasked for what it truly was. The billionaire shifted in his chair, clearly aware of the weight of their stares. He tried to regain control of the evening, straightening his posture, lifting his chin in that familiar manner that demanded attention. But the moment had already slipped from him. Stolen in a single exchange he could neither erase nor rewrite. And then, just when he thought the silence couldn't deepen further, one of the most respected guests at the table, a dignitary from the Middle East, leaned forward. His voice was warm, smooth, and fluent in Arabic as he addressed the waitress. He praised her. He spoke with genuine admiration for her fluency, her control, and the dignity with which she carried herself. He even complimented the clarity of her accent, saying she spoke the language with a precision that few outside native speakers could achieve. The words were not casual. They carried the weight of respect, and in a room like this, that respect was currency worth more than money. All eyes turned to her as she accepted the compliment with a graceful nod, thanking him in the same flawless Arabic. The contrast was stark. While she radiated poise, the billionaire's own language had betrayed him, turned into a mirror reflecting his cruelty back at him. A flush of embarrassment crept across his face. He let out a laugh, short and sharp, an unconvincing attempt to brush off the tension. "It was only a joke," he insisted, switching back to English, his voice strained with false amusement. He waved a hand toward the waitress as if her reaction had been nothing more than a misunderstanding, as if the entire room hadn't witnessed the insult and her flawless reply. But no one bought it. His laughter fell flat against the silence. The guests weren't laughing with him anymore. They weren't laughing at all. The waitress, meanwhile, did not smirk or bask in triumph. She didn't meet his humiliation with arrogance of her own. She continued her work with the same calm, professionalism as before, collecting empty plates, refilling glasses, and ensuring the table remained flawless. But at one point, when she returned to place a fresh dish before him, she paused just long enough to speak. Her voice was soft, her tone measured, but her words carried a weight that pierced deeper than any raised voice could have. "Respect doesn't cost anything," she said, her eyes meeting his for only a brief moment. "But its absence costs everything." The table stilled. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Her words, though spoken gently, struck with the clarity of a bell. In a silent hall, guests glanced at one another, the truth of the statement echoing in their minds. It wasn't just a reminder, it was a lesson, one that resonated beyond the insult and beyond the man it had been directed to. In that moment, her dignity became the centerpiece of the evening. The billionaire's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he shifted uncomfortably. He looked down at his plate, pushing the food around with his fork, though his appetite had long vanished. His wealth, his status, the power that had shielded him for decades, it all felt hollow now, fragile in the face of a truth that had exposed him completely. He tried to muster a response to regain his footing with some clever remark, but nothing came. The weight of her words pinned him to silence. As the evening dragged on, the energy around the table refused to return to its earlier warmth. Guests spoke politely, but their tones were subdued, their attention divided. Where once they had leaned toward the billionaire, eager to be near the glow of his influence, now their eyes sought out the waitress as she passed, offering her small nods of respect, subtle smiles of acknowledgement. The shift was undeniable. The power he had wielded so effortlessly had slipped from his grasp, redirected toward the very person he had dismissed as invisible. The billionaire grew restless. He adjusted his cufflinks, checked his watch more than once, and shifted in his seat as though the fabric of the chair had suddenly become uncomfortable. He felt exposed, trapped in a spotlight he had not chosen, and each whispered glance only deepened the sense of isolation. For the first time in years, he was not the master of the room. He was its lesson. When the final course arrived, he barely touched it. The laughter that once surrounded him had vanished entirely, replaced by a politeness that felt colder than silence. He excused himself before dessert, his voice low, his departure abrupt. His entourage scrambled to follow, but the damage had already been done. He left the table not as the admired figure who had walked in, but as a man visibly shaken, stripped, of the aura he had so carefully built. The room lingered in his absence, a quiet sense of justice woven into the air. And as the waitress continued her duties, unshaken, her quiet strength spoke louder than his wealth ever could. The restaurant that had buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses only hours earlier now rested in near silence. The chandeliers still glowed faintly, casting soft light on the polished floors, but the music had stopped, and most of the staff had already gone home. Only a few remained, moving quietly as they stacked chairs and reset tables for the following day. Among them was the waitress, the same young woman who had turned an entire dinner on its head with nothing more than poise and words. She moved with the same steady grace she had displayed all evening, her hands clearing plates, folding napkins, and wiping down tables. There was no sign of triumph in her demeanor, no lingering trace of the drama that had unfolded earlier. For her, the night was ending as it had begun, with professionalism, routine, and dignity. The heavy doors to the restaurant opened again, and footsteps echoed softly across the floor. When she looked up, she saw him, the billionaire, but not as he had been. He was alone now, stripped of his entourage, his associates, and the wall of laughter and approval that usually shielded him. Without them, he seemed smaller, not in stature, but in presence. His shoulders, once squared with dominance, carried a different weight. His steps were hesitant, almost reluctant, as if each one required more effort than he was used to giving. For a man who lived in power, humility was a foreign landscape, and he was stepping onto it cautiously. He paused a few feet from her, his usual sharpness dulled by uncertainty. For a long moment, neither spoke. The waitress set down the glass she had been polishing and turned toward him fully, her expression neutral, calm. She didn't ask why. He was there, didn't fill the silence with questions or remarks. She simply waited, and in that waiting, the power shifted once again. Not through force, but through the quiet authority of patience. Finally, he spoke. His voice, usually commanding, carried none of the confidence that had once dominated the room. Instead, it was low, strained, and almost searching. He admitted he had been wrong. He confessed that he had judged her unfairly, too quickly, and with the arrogance of a man who thought status gave him the right to decide someone's worth. He said he had assumed too much, that her presence as a server meant she lacked intelligence, refinement, or education. He acknowledged that his words had been cruel, careless, and rooted in pride. Each admission seemed to cost him, like stones he was forcing himself to put down after carrying them for too long. The waitress listened quietly, her eyes steady on him, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She didn't interrupt, didn't soften his discomfort, and didn't make it easier for him. When he finished, the silence stretched again, but this time it was not heavy with arrogance, it was heavy with honesty. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, carrying no malice, no bitterness. "Power fades," she said simply, "but dignity stays." The words hung in the air like a truth too clear to be challenged. She didn't need to raise her voice or lecture him. She didn't need to remind him of the humiliation he had suffered earlier. Her statement alone was enough. It was not just a response to him, but a universal reminder. Power may impress, intimidate, or command for a time, but it cannot outlast the quiet strength of respect and integrity. For the first time, the billionaire didn't try to argue. He didn't dismiss her words as naive or beneath him. He simply stood there, absorbing them, his usual quick retorts absent. He listened, truly listened. And in that moment, something cracked inside him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, like the first fissure in a wall built too high for too long. He nodded once, a gesture small but sincere, before turning, to leave. He didn't try to reclaim the final word, didn't attempt to smooth over the evening with money or charm. He walked out silently, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty restaurant until the doors closed behind him. The waitress returned to her work, her head held high, her face serene. She hadn't sought revenge, nor had she chased recognition. What she had offered was something far rarer, a lesson in humility delivered with dignity intact. The billionaire left with more than he had arrived with, though not in the way he had expected, and as the lights dimmed and the staff finished their final tasks, the closing narration lingered. True power isn't in wealth or titles. It's in respect, humility, and the courage to stand tall when underestimated. The camera would linger one last time on the waitress, walking away slowly, her back straight, her steps steady, her silhouette framed by the soft, golden glow of the chandeliers. She left not as a symbol of defiance, but as one of dignity, a quiet reminder that some victories are not shouted, but lived.